there were ever any doubts about Russia's resolve to capture Kyiv, Mike was talking about those new satellite images revealing the harsh reality. That convoy they're talking about is said to be 40 miles long, tanks and trucks. It's now creeping toward the capital city. It's a slow rate of speed, but it is still moving, and so far it has not been stopped. Let's bring in retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis. And Colonel, as you look at the pictures of that convoy, 40 miles, it looks very ominous. I mean, I know they have to go through a major choke point there, so there will be some resistance along the way. Do you fear this is different, Colonel? Do you feel like, this convoy might get in and surround the city of Kyiv?
Well, I mean, there's no question that's what it's intended to do, and that's where it's headed to. But I'll tell you, there's much more ominous problems down in the south, where your correspondent just mentioned some of the fighting that's going on there. A closer examination of that entire front, not just an individual city, shows that the Russian forces have been making substantial gains over the course of these 6 days and are now in a position to where they are close to closing a pincer movement that could trap upwards of 45,000 Ukrainian soldiers in there. One of the big disparities between the Ukrainian and the Russian forces is that the Ukrainian forces is basically an infantry organization that doesn't have much mobility, and the Russians have a great deal of mobility. If they shut them off there, then they can almost completely cut out the southern front of this war and then turn all of the Russian forces back in the direction of Kyiv, and there's almost nothing in between there that can stop them. The intention appears to be, from all that I can assess here, is that both from the area of the Kharkiv, from the south down in the Mariupol area, is that they want to have two more axes that move towards Kyiv in conjunction with that group coming down from the north. And probably the biggest difference is that it appears now that they're going to use heavy artillery, heavy rocket fire, and the air power, which they have mostly held in abeyance so far. If they bring all that to bear, I'm afraid no matter how brave or anything else, the Ukrainian armed forces just can't stop it.
But you talk about that air power, Colonel, and so far it does not appear that the Russians have locked down the Ukrainian air power, because of some of these convoys, Ukrainian convoys, have been on the move as well, moving fairly freely throughout the country. Much smaller convoys, I give you, but haven't really seen the air resistance that we thought they would see.
Yeah, well, because they haven't employed it. It's not that they don't have it. They have severely degraded the anti-aircraft capability of Ukraine. And that's the reason why you don't really see any of the Ukraine Air Force. If the Ukraine had any capacity to get into the air itself, that whole long 40-mile column you're talking about would be just like shooting ducks in a barrel. But they can't get up in the air. But the Russians can. They just haven't launched them yet. And that's the danger.
You say significant gains, Colonel. I want to play this soundbite from General David Petraeus and then get your response on the other side. Watch.
This is going terribly for Vladimir Putin and his forces. They designed a flawed concept with multiple axes of advance. They haven't weighted the main effort into Kyiv, the capital. After all, the main objective is to topple the government and replace President Zelensky with someone who is pro-Russian. They failed to integrate their air and ground capabilities. They're not achieving combined arms effects of infantry, armor, artillery. Their logistics are a mess.
I'm guessing, Colonel, that you would disagree with that assessment at some point.
Well, without question, that's how it started. That's the huge error that they made. We've now been able to identify through a number of sources, some of which came from the Pentagon, that Russia really thought this was going to be a cakewalk. They thought they could just come in here and not use the standard combined arms operation. They didn't have to use coordinated efforts. They could just drive some tanks in, and they thought that the Ukraine army would melt away like the Afghan army did when the Taliban started last summer, but that didn't happen. So now that they got a bloody nose, but the problem is they have learned from their mistakes. They had like a 2 full day pause for most of these places, and now that a lot of that 40-mile stuff is the logistics moving up. So now that they have learned from their mistakes, and they expressly didn't use a lot of their heavy power because they didn't want to destroy a lot of the infrastructure. Now they're in a position to where they're going to, it appears, unleash all of these things that they haven't done so far. So I disagree with General Petraeus that they can't do it. They chose not to, and they made an error. Now it looks like they're prepared to do it the right way.
So what you're saying is the people of Ukraine need weapons, and they need them badly. We're talking about anti-tank weapons and Javelin missiles. The question is, how will they quickly get them in? I mean, we talk about how the sanctions were slow. The weapons were also slow getting into Ukraine.
Well, I mean, I got to be honest with you, Tracy. It's not going to matter. I mean, number one, it's going to be really hard to get them in there in the number that they need to, because Russia has now, in the last 24 hours, been bombing a lot of the airfields in the western part where some of that stuff might have been flown into, so that they can interdict it to keep it from getting to where it needs to go. But the bigger issue is, though, you can't just add on a bunch of stuff in the middle of warfare and think that that's going to make a difference, because it's the mobility, it's the training, it's the unit's ability to have combined arms operations, which the Ukrainians just don't have very much of it. And I'm afraid it's just not going to matter.
Yeah, and we should know, when that convoy comes down, they have to go right by the Gostelin Air Base, and it's a question right now who actually controls that air base, and we wonder if some of those convoy members will actually stay and fight and try to take that air base over. Colonel, it's always great to hear from you. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Trace.